This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. Tuesdays can get a bad rap. Sometimes the best that can be said about them are that they're just the day that's the furthest from the next Monday. But not Super Tuesday. More than a quarter of the House of Representatives faces a primary race on March 5th, and it also is the starting gun for two high-profile Senate races. And while not all these races are competitive, or even necessary, there are major implications for November's general election, especially in California, Texas, North Carolina, and Alabama. We'll discuss those and more on Super Tuesday, about Super Tuesday, with Roll Call's campaign reporters Mary Ellen McIntire and Daniela Altimari. Daniela, Mel, welcome back to Political Theater.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with California, most populous state in the country. 52 House races plus a Senate race, all up. I don't know. Did you just did you just get the short end? I don't know how. I know that sometimes this can be a cruel math in determining who covers what races. But in addition to just having the most number of House seats, it also has probably the most number of competitive seats, at least concentrated in a few areas. Daniela, let's talk about those House races that you're covering.
Yeah, fascinating. Many really competitive, and some are getting quite nasty. Some of these House races. It's also worth noting that California has a different way than much of the country of holding their primaries. So they're nonpartisan primaries, which means the top two finishers, regardless of party, will proceed to November. And that's a bit unusual. It can make for some interesting dynamics. Perhaps we're seeing, for instance, in the 22nd district, in Central California, Representative Valadao is the incumbent Republican. That's obviously a battleground seat, and he faces a challenge from his right. And the preferred Democrat, Rudy Salas, who narrowly lost the last time, is facing a challenge. I'm not sure if you could say it's necessarily from his left, but a challenge or a fight with another Democrat, and potentially the two favored candidates, the incumbent and the preferred Democrat, may get iced out. It could happen. Will it happen? We don't know, but it is a potential under this system that California uses. So it makes for some kind of unusual dynamics that perhaps you don't see in other states.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this podcast and start, with California, is that, again, not to minimize the stakes for the future of democracy and so forth with the presidential election, but the presidential primaries at this point are not competitive. We are likely on this glide path towards a rematch of former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. But this kicks off a big round of primaries, and California just has so many competitive seats. You mentioned the Valadao seat. Valadao, is always from the get-go has always faced a competitive race. And then, we've got a bunch of seats in the Orange County, extended LA area that really, I mean, when you're talking about a House majority of just a handful or a few people, every one of these races is important.
Yeah, and it's true. So much of the country, through gerrymandering or other factors, there aren't competitive races. So the fact that so many of the races who will determine who controls the House are in California. You mentioned Orange County. One of the most intense races there is for the seat that is now occupied by Katie Porter. It's a real battleground district, and there's a lot of tension between the two Democrats who are seeking that seat. So that has really, become very, very ugly in a lot of ways as we head into Tuesday.
And the wild card there too is that Porter is running for the Senate, which has made this seat open. But the guy that she beat in 2022, is also running. I mean, he's got he's not maybe the strongest candidate, but he has name recognition, which is not nothing. One of these markets.
Yep, he's got a lot of money. He actually, there is another Republican running as well, sort of from his right, but Scott Baugh, the one that we're talking about, the sort of the leading Republican contender, is in pretty good shape because he can watch these two Democrats kind of tear each other apart. And if there's two slots available, the conventional thinking, given the makeup of that district, is that one will go to him and one will go to one of the two Democrats. We'll see which one. And you mentioned, Katie Porter, that the fact that was her seat, the fact that there are 3 House candidates from California running for Senate, it has created a lot of openings, even in districts. The other 2 districts are, very safe for Democrats. But, congressional seats don't open up all that often, right. Although maybe this year they're opening up a little more often than they have in the past. But you're seeing people who maybe are looking at a 20-year career in Congress. If they can win this primary, they'll be shooed in for the general election, and then they sit pretty comfortably for a long time. So it explains sort of the interest in some of these races where you're seeing, 8, 10, 12 candidates running for the open seats.
Yeah, and again, as you said, the primary, the way that the California structured their primary, where it's just the top 2 finishers, regardless of party, move on to November, has created a dynamic that is not replicated very easily. I mean, Washington and Louisiana also have, a different sort of primary system, but I feel like California, because of just its size and the complexity of the electorate, just is one of those things that's just worth watching, so much. Yeah, but those 2, as you mentioned, the 3 primary Democrats running for that Senate seat, Katie Porter's got the swing district. She won it in 2018. She probably would continue to win it, but as you said, these Senate seats don't come up that often. This seat was opened by the death of Dianne Feinstein, and who hadn't held the seat since 1992, and I mean, it's a generational thing. Barbara Lee's Oakland-based seat will likely be a Democratic seat. Adam Schiff's Beverly Hills and L.A. seat will likely be a Democrat. But for those people who get those, I mean, they're sitting pretty if they want to be there for a while. So let's talk about the Senate race. I mean, we've hinted at it a little bit. This is heavily favored to continue to be a Democratic seat, regardless of who finishes in the top 2. But I think the conventional wisdom for a while was that that Porter and Schiff had the inside track, that Lee had an outside shot. But it would really be a battle for second place in the primary between Porter and Lee, and then former Dodgers and Padres first baseman Steve Garvey, a Republican, got into the race, and it seems like he is beginning to put a little bit of daylight between himself and Porter, at least if you believe some of the polls that we've seen recently.
Yeah. And again, that's where the California system comes into play because, normally you'd have, the Democrats competing for one slot and the Republicans competing for another. So this does make for some interesting machinations, where, Schiff is, trying to boost some of the other candidates and, trying to sort of help the Republican help Garvey take that slot, that perhaps would have been won by Katie Porter. But, I guess we just don't know how it's all going to shake out, but it is fascinating and it is, very unusual, I think.
Yeah. All right, let's shift a little bit to another one of the states that's on the docket for Super Tuesday. Not nearly as populous a state, but there's a significant primary there happening. Marianne, let's talk about this member versus member race in Alabama.
Yes. Really interesting race here in Alabama's 1st district. This is the southernmost district of Alabama. And we have come to expect member-on-member races in redistricting years. 2 years ago, we saw several of them across the country. This is the first one we've seen this year because Alabama had some off-cycle redistricting after a Supreme Court ruling last year. So we have Alabama Representatives Jerry Carl and Barry Moore, who are running against each other in the 1st District in this primary on Tuesday. And these are two, this is Alabama. It's a pretty ruby red state. These are two conservative members of Congress. They are also not particularly well-known members of Congress. These are not, people that, you were seeing talked about or talking on Fox News or CNN all the time in a normal year. So I think that's sort of a different dynamic here as well. It's been a really nationalized race. If you look at a lot of their television ads, they are focusing on issues that are going to get Republican voters riled up, that kind of core meat issues for them. We're looking at, a lot of focus on the border and how they have both worked to try to control the Biden border crisis, as they've called it. We've seen it starting to get a little bit nasty, as these races tend to do. Carl, in particular, has gone a bit negative on Barry Moore, who has sort of shot back and said, if you're going negative, you're not doing well. But argued some back and forth as well. They've gone back and forth on taxes and their personal tax history a bit. We've also recently seen Barry Moore put out an ad this week. He was talking about, I haven't voted for any supplemental funding for Ukraine, big issue amongst Republican voters. But he's sort of arguing if we didn't, have this supplemental funding going outside of the country, we'd be able to potentially finance a bridge in the area that really needs to be financed. I was talking to a political science professor in the area who was sort of walking me on some of the history of how, they haven't been able to get local funding for the bridge. People really freaked out at the potential of this being a toll bridge. He's sort of arguing if we don't fund the war in Ukraine, maybe we can fund this bridge down here across the bay. So we'll see.
Bless his heart. That's how it works in Congress, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's just one of those things that Republican voters, if they aren't supportive of that, they might not be aware of exactly, how these different funding projects work. So I think we'll see. There hasn't been a ton of public polling available, and most people are expecting this is going to be a pretty close race. Both of their hometowns, so their kind of core political bases, are in this new district. Jerry Carl currently represents the 1st District, so he's probably a bit more well-known in the district. But like I said, there's been, a lot of both of them have been running a lot of ads. There's been some outside spending. We saw the Club for Growth recently come in to try to help shore up support for Barry Moore. And the other thing that's sort of interesting here, I talked about both of these guys being pretty conservative members of Congress. Barry Moore is a member of the Freedom Caucus and Jerry Carl is not. And you can see that if you look at how members of Congress have contributed to their individual campaigns through their own leadership PACs and whatnot. Carl's support has really come from a lot of Freedom Caucus members, many of whom have supported him. He was campaigning, I believe it was last month, with Jim Jordan, one of the founders of the Freedom Caucus, whereas Carl's support has come. He got a large donation from Steve Scalise, the majority leader, and other members who are kind of considered to be more pragmatists, like Carl is considered to be, and a bit more leadership aligned as well.
And also, not for nothing in the significance for the next Congress is that part of the reason that the Supreme Court ordered this, put in motion at least the redrawing of the district is because they said that the previous maps violated the Voting Rights Act because with the size of Alabama's black population, the fact that it only had one district represented or where there was even a shot for a black member or a Democrat to win it was in violation of the law. So this led to some, there was quite a bit of drama getting this district, but the result will be one of these men will lose this race, and the pickup in the other district that is created with more Democrats, more black members of the population will likely result in a Democratic pickup, which is again not nothing.
No,
the breakdown is less than a handful of votes separating the two parties in the House.
No, and in the second district, this new district that is a likely Democratic pickup, there are a lot of Democrats who are running for this seat. Alabama does go to a runoff, so it's potential that, the top two vote getters, if they don't pass, I believe it's 50%, will go to a runoff later this year to decide who the Democratic nominee is. Many of those candidates have put varying amounts of their own money into their campaigns in some way. So it's a pretty open but interesting race. There also is a fairly competitive Republican primary there, which sort of to me suggests that Republicans do think that they might be able to put up some level of a fight here, but the district is now not quite 50% African American, but close. So we'll see sort of if Republicans do end up making that a race, or if that is, the kind of seat that Democrats can really rely on to be a safe blue seat.
All right, let's go a little bit north, but staying in the South, to North Carolina. North Carolina also has new maps.
Yes.
They vote. They're a Super Tuesday state. They were relatively evenly split, especially for a purple state like North Carolina. After in the 2022 election cycle, the Republican legislature approved a new map that heavily favors the Republicans, and they're looking at picking up a few seats. Talk about that, the dynamic there, and what has what we might look for as the returns start coming in on Tuesday in North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, right now, North Carolina has several competitive seats under their current maps, and I believe it's a 7-7 split. So this is definitely like a purple state. There's been, a lot focused on in the last couple of years about, North Carolina, just how competitive is it at a national level. In terms of House races for 2024, Republicans are really looking to pick up a lot of seats to help try to shore up and grow their majority in 2024. 3 Democrats, Kathy Manning, Wiley Nickel, and Jeff Jackson, said they would not run again. Under the new maps, their seats were just so there was really no way for them to win these seats. These are seats that President Trump would have won by double-digit points in 2020. So there are now, Republican primaries in those states. In the 14th district, Tim Moore, the North Carolina House Speaker, looks like he's a pretty sure bet to win the Republican nomination there and go on to, become a member of Congress next year. In the 13th district, it's a much broader primary, lots of candidates, lots of self-funders. North Carolina has a 30% runoff rule. So if the top vote getter does not clear 30%, it will go to a runoff similar to Alabama later in the year. The 6th district, that's the seat that Kathy Manning is not running for again. I mean, just to kind of show how much Democrats aren't competing here is after Manning said she wasn't going to run again, Democrats haven't even put up a candidate in the primary for this seat. So whoever wins the Republican primary here is definitely going to Congress. But it's an interesting race. This is, I think, one of the ones that has gotten some of the most attention because of who the candidates in this district are. We have former Congressman Mark Walker, who was running for governor until this new map came out. And he used to represent a version of this district in Congress. So he's running for a comeback. You have Bo Hines, who lost to Wiley Nickel in the 13th district 2 years ago in a competitive race. He's backed by the Club for Growth. So he's got a lot of outside spending supporting him. You have a healthcare lobbyist, Addison McDowell, who is backed by President Trump. So you have another example here of Trump and the club backing different candidates, and we'll see sort of how effective that endorsement will be in this district. And you also have the 2022 Republican nominee in this district, Christian Castelli, who is a retired Green Beret, as well as a couple of other candidates. So these are crowded fields. There are a couple of other open, safe seats. We have the seat that Patrick McHenry, the chairman of the Financial Services Committee.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And the speaker, Speaker pro tem,
yes,
the very first of we've ever had.
Yes, and he, has gotten some attention in the last couple of days. It seems that he has seemed to be a little bit freed up to speak his mind in some interviews. But there's an interesting race to replace him in the 10th district, where immigration is really playing a major focus between 2 of the candidates in that seat who are sort of gathering some of the most attention. And then the last North Carolina seat that I'll mention is the 1st district, which under this new map is really the sole competitive district in the state. You have freshman Congressman Don Davis, who is the Democrat. He's running in Tuesday's primary unopposed, and there are 2 Republicans who are seeking to challenge him. And I think this race is, sort of an example of a lot of the races that we saw across the country in 2022 when you have a sort of more MAGA-like candidate and a more establishment-type candidate. Sandy Smith, who lost to Davis 2 years ago, also lost to his predecessor 4 years before that, is running in sort of this more MAGA lane. She's known to voters. Like I said, she's lost a couple of races before. You also have more of a political newcomer, Lori Buckhout, who is running against her. She led in one poll that I've seen in this district from late January, and she has outside backing from the Congressional Leadership Fund, sort of the main super PAC for House Republicans. So we'll see. I think that Sandy Smith has obviously got a losing record here. If she's the nominee, I think there's probably a little bit less hope that this is a seat where they can really be competitive in 2024. But Republicans are really hoping that this could be a potential pickup for them. And if Republicans can hold this seat, it'll be the first time they've held this district in a very, very long time.
Yeah. Let's go to Texas. Trundle down I-10 back to Texas, Daniela. 38 seats, 38 House seats and a Senate race. And, Texas goes, back and forth between, different levels of competitiveness. It's gotten more competitive at the federal level over the last few years, but it still tilts Republican. But what are some of those marquee races you're looking at on the House? Let's start with the House first, and then we'll talk about the Senate.
Yeah, so in the House, there's several interesting ones. In Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee, who has represented that district for decades, she decided last year she was going to run for mayor of Houston. And she lost in the runoff to another candidate. But meanwhile, her former intern, Amanda Edwards, an attorney, former city council member, she got into the race. And when Jackson Lee lost the mayor's runoff, she said, well, I'll just run for re-election to Congress. But Amanda Edwards wasn't going anywhere. So we now have a situation where we have the intern challenging her former boss in the Democratic primary. So, and
Shakespearean.
It's fascinating. And Edwards has really framed her campaign as, voice of a new generation kind of thing. She's significantly younger than Jackson Lee. So that's
and one. Also has had no trouble raising money either, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. And Jackson Lee has struggled because, for most of the time she was running for a different office. So, so that's an interesting one, just kind of a one-off, really, no larger lessons at play. But, the Senate race will sort of test this idea that Texas is turning purple. Colin Allred is trying to do what, others have tried and failed. He's running against Ted Cruz, but his decision to seek the Senate seat leaves his seat open. And that, again, similar to California, has just, there's a plethora of candidates there, Democrats, because it is a strong Democratic district, that are running because it's an open seat. And again, not too many bites of that apple. There are 2 other interesting open seats, both held by Republicans and very likely to remain in Republican hands. Kay Granger, obviously, as we know, has decided to retire. So that leaves her seat open, and that's similar to the dynamic that Mel discussed in North Carolina. That sort of a ideological battle between the various wings of the Republican Party. You have the sort of Chamber of Commerce type guy, and then you have the more cultural conservative. Another open seat in Texas, the 26th district, I believe, Michael Burgess, also a longtime member, not running again. And that has also drawn a large crowd, but among the 2 sort of top contenders, they are both sort of culture warriors. You have Brandon Gill, who was involved with the making of the 2000 Mules movie about election conspiracies. And so he's, sort of in that camp. And then you have the mayor of Southlake, which, has a suburban town that has sort of gained national notoriety for its war on woke in the public schools, and has become sort of a battleground for some of these culture issues. And then there's some other candidates as well. So both of those open seats, they're likely to remain in Republican hands, but very interesting. And in Texas, it's also runoff if you don't make that 50%. So we'll see what happens. The runoff isn't until I think the Tuesday after Memorial Day. So we'll see if we have to wait to see who some of these nominees are. You also have, some incumbents that are facing strong challenges, particularly it's Tony Gonzalez, right, who is come under fire from members of his own party for his vote on, the bipartisan gun control bill. Uvalde is in his district. He voted for that. He also has taken some heat on border issues. So, he is facing some challenges. There's also a rematch in another sort of close to the border district. Monica de la Cruz and Michelle Vallejo are running against each other again. De la Cruz won the last time, so we'll see what happens.
And on the Senate side, as you mentioned, I mean, like this, Ted Cruz is his unfavorable numbers are always attract the attention of the National Party because they think that they can find a lane. They thought that they had cracked the code with Beto O'Rourke in 2018, and O'Rourke came just short. I think by 3 points or something like that. He lost. But Allred needs to get through a primary himself on the Senate side, where he's favored, but still, not able to pivot completely to Ted Cruz at this point.
Yeah, he's had to spend some money, which that always hurts, I guess, when you have to spend money before you're getting to the main event. You have to spend money in the primary. I think the last poll I saw had him very comfortably ahead, so I don't think he'll have any problems reaching that 50% threshold. But it is still just sort of one more hurdle that you have to face. Some folks told me, and probably Marilyn's heard this as well, I'm sure, that one of the problems in Texas is just as you said. You look at it on paper and you think, wow, Ted Cruz is vulnerable. We can, turn the state purple, maybe even blue. You look at some of the cities in Texas that are very liberal. But the problem is that there are many people in Texas who just don't vote. And that's the biggest hurdle to the Democrats' hopes of, shifting the calculus there.
Yeah. All right, let's end it where all things should end, in Arkansas. Again, possibly the state that demonstrates how politics, how party ID has flipped the most. In the 1990s and early 2000s, you had an all Democratic, congressional delegation. It's hard to even imagine that now, even in the cities like Little Rock. This is as you said about Alabama, a ruby red state. I mean, it is hard to imagine that Bill Clinton came from Arkansas at this point, a Democratic, two-term Democratic president. And it's not, again, we're not talking about any seat flipping partisan control, but Mel, there was a race that you're keeping an eye on because of some of internal politics here up on the Hill that affects one of the members. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, there's an Arkansas member who I've sort of had my eye on for the last couple of months, ever since, if we go back to October, I sort of pivoted away from whatever the campaign trail was looking like back then and covered the House Republicans' efforts to elect a new speaker after Kevin McCarthy was ousted. And one of those members in particular, Steve Womack, he did not vote to oust McCarthy. I think it's safe to call him somewhat of a McCarthy ally, but he was a member who voted against Jim Jordan for speaker. As you guys might recall, he was the second speaker nominee to go to the process here for Republicans. And Womack was one of the many members, about 20 or so, give or take, who voted against Jim Jordan on the floor. And he was one that sort of was like, oh, could he attract a primary challenger here because of this? And he has. Guy named Clint Penzo I questioned how competitive this race could be. Steve Womack has raised significantly more money than his challenger, who does have some outside group support, but not quite to the extent of money that Womack reported having middle of February. So we'll see. It's also congressional elections are weird, primaries are weird. A fluke could certainly happen here. I think, from folks that I'm talking to, there kind of seems to be yeah, he's got this challenger. Everyone's sort of trying to figure out what it's like, but every great surprise in a congressional election is somewhat usually not foreseen. So I think this is one that, I'm kind of keeping tabs on, maybe not expecting actually too much, but if we're going to see a surprise in the congressional elections on Tuesday, this could potentially be it.
Yeah, I mean, I when people ask about races like this, like the probably the best example of the last decade or so was Eric Cantor losing his primary in Virginia in 2014, and the way that I try to explain to people is that it's not. It on paper it doesn't make sense, right? That someone who's in a position of authority or has a name ID and so forth would lose a race, particularly if they're in leadership. Womack's not in leadership, but he is sort of leadership adjacent, right? He's
a former
ally.
committee chair.
Yeah, former committee chair, and so there's that. And in a situation like this, where it's 2024. The presidential, contest is not competitive in either the primary stage or the general election stage. There's no Senate race that they're dealing with. There's no statewide, race for governor or anything like that to bring people to the polls. There's no polarizing ballot initiative and so forth. So these are all things that work, to drive down engagement and drive down participation. So when you're talking about, like congressional primaries usually don't get huge numbers, gonzo numbers anyway. In a situation like this where people are like, what's the big deal? It doesn't take that many people. A few people who are like, well, I don't know, this guy, maybe let's give him a chance, or maybe somebody's pissed off at Womack. I mean, you're just talking about a very few votes that change the results in this case. Maybe it's on autopilot and Womack's got it, lined up, but just ask Eric Cantor, who had probably never heard Dave Bratt's name before, 2014. And you've got a real result. So I like that as the wild card for Super Tuesday. We should just to recap for everybody, 115 seats in the House in play. That's roughly a quarter of the House of Representatives, and then 2 high-profile Senate races. Daniela, Mary Ellen, thank you so much for going through this. It's a lot. It's a lot of money, a lot of names, a lot of states, all that, and and it's just the beginning of March. We've got a few more high-profile primaries later in the month in Ohio and Illinois, but we got a little rest for the time being, where we just have to go to the State of the Union and things like that. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and listeners out there, thank you for listening or watching. If you're watching on YouTube, please share this, tell your friends, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.